Afghanistan is a land of mountains and deserts in Central Asia. It shares common borders with Iran, Pakistan, China and the Soviet Union. Afghanistan has never been colonized, but Afghan history has been turbulent. The Soviet invasion of December 1979 was particularly traumatic. In 10 years of fighting, some 13,000 Soviet soldiers and an estimated 1 million Afghans have been killed. More than 5 million Afghans, 1 in 3 of the pre-war population, have fled their country to find sanctuary in sprawling refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. The refugees live in appalling conditions and are heavily dependent upon international aid for food, shelter and basic health care. But the people that remain inside Afghanistan continue to suffer. Their villages have been bombed, their crops and irrigation systems have been destroyed, and there are acute shortages of food. They receive little outside assistance. Afghan Aid was established to send humanitarian aid to these forgotten communities. Since 1983, Afghan Aid has sent cash for food and clothing and pioneered village assistance projects that provide oxen, seeds and fertilizer to boost farm production. Afghan Aid has also established a tailoring project that employs disabled refugees and an ambulance network that ferries the sick and wounded from the border to hospitals in Pakistan. Gladstone said of Afghanistan that it was a far-off land about which we know little. His words are as true today as they were 100 years ago. Afghanistan is, for most of us, a remote country, and yet it has always been a land of great strategic importance. For the deserts and mountains of Afghanistan command the crossroads of Asia and the gateway to India. They have been fought over for centuries and have played host to traders and invaders of world renown. In 329 BC, Alexander the Great passed through Afghanistan on his way to India and established a Greek civilization. Later, in the 8th century AD, Afghanistan fell under the influence of the Arabs and Persians, and Islam became the predominant religion. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the remnants of Alexander's civilization were swept away by the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. At the end of the 13th century, Marco Polo travelled through Afghanistan along the Silk Route to China, and later the armies of the Mughal emperors crossed the Khyber and conquered India. In 1839 and 1878, the armies of British India tried in vain to subjugate the Afghans. A century later, the Soviet invasion of 1979 heralded a violent new episode in Afghan history. But the Soviets failed to learn from the lessons of the past. For while Afghanistan has been invaded many times, it has never been conquered. Afghans live in isolated rural communities, and like mountain people the world over, they jealously guard their independence. Their character and their society have been forged from the imposing, inhospitable mountains of the Hindu Kush range. Each valley is different from the next, and there is a strong tradition of regional self-determination and independence. Afghan society is still mainly tribal, and the tribes have their own strict codes of behaviour and their own institutions of self-government. The mountains that have made Afghanistan a difficult country to conquer have also made it a difficult country to modernise and develop. Communications are rudimentary. Many villages can only be reached by foot or on horseback, and journeys to Kabul, the capital, can take weeks. The vast majority of Afghans are farmers, and there has been only limited industrialization. Traditional methods of agriculture prevail. Wheat is the most important crop and is the staple diet of most Afghans. Rice, cotton, vegetables and a variety of fruits are also grown. In the higher mountains, the people rely upon flocks of goats and sheep for their livelihood, and more than 1 million Afghans live as nomads. The Afghan people are strongly attached to their land, and it is usually owned by the same families and clans for generations. This attachment to the land has shaped Afghan society and Afghan values. The Islamic religion is the common bond that holds the ethnically diverse and geographically scattered peoples of Afghanistan together. 80% of Afghans are Orthodox Sunni Muslims, and the remaining 20% are Shias. Afghanistan has many beautiful mosques and shrines, and the mosque at Mazar-e-Sharif is one of the Muslim world's most sacred places of pilgrimage. In 1979, following the revolution in Iran, the Russians feared that a tide of Islamic fundamentalism would spread through Afghanistan and on into the predominantly Muslim republics of Soviet Central Asia. This fear coincided with the deteriorating position of the communist government in Kabul. The communists had taken power a year earlier in a military coup, but their ill-advised land and educational reforms had prompted a spontaneous uprising in the countryside amongst people who were determined to defend their faith, their culture and their way of life. By the summer of 1979, the Muslim rebel movement was beginning to threaten the survival of the Kabul regime. Soviet President Brezhnev, fearing the loss of a friendly neighbor, decided to act.
This is Radio Moscow World Service. And now here is the news, read by Vladimir Danchev. First the headlines. Leaders of Pushtu and other tribes in Afghanistan have voiced disagreement with the government's policies.
There are reports from Afghanistan tonight that the country's president has been overthrown. The coup came after thousands of Soviet troops were said to have moved in over the last 2 days to help crush a rebellion against the regime of President Hafizullah Amin.
There were Russian tanks blocking off the main roads out of the city and to the airport.
How many tanks altogether, would you say?
I can't give an accurate estimate, though there were hundreds.
Hundreds of tanks?
Hundreds.
On Christmas Eve, motorized units of the Red Army crossed Afghanistan's northern border and airborne troops landed at Kabul. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had begun. President Amin was killed, and the Russians replaced him with Babrak Karmal, former Afghan ambassador to Czechoslovakia and a founder member of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, the Afghan Communist Party. The world condemned the Soviet invasion. The United Nations called for an immediate withdrawal of Soviet troops, and this call has been repeated every year since. In Afghanistan, what had begun as a spontaneous rural rebellion was now a war of national liberation. The invasion had caught the world off guard, and the Afghan people were poorly equipped to resist it. Helsinki Watch, the international human rights group, described the conflict that followed as a bitter and unequal contest. The war pitted a well-armed modern army against a ragamuffin coalition of farmers, workers, merchants and mullahs. The fighters who made up the Afghan resistance called themselves the Mujahideen, meaning soldiers of God, and their dead were Shahid, martyrs. The Mujahideen gained from bitter experience, and over the years they became a more effective military force. A new generation of young, educated Afghan leaders emerged. Massoud from the Panjshir Valley in northern Afghanistan is one of the most famous. He used hit-and-run guerrilla tactics to harry the Soviets. The Soviets were unable to pin down the Mujahideen, so they retaliated by bombing villages that they suspected of supporting or harbouring them. The resulting cycle of violence caused misery, destruction and death on a massive scale. The villages and the ordinary people who live in them suffered most. In a single air raid on the village of Pushtun Zargun, 70 people lost their lives. All but 4 were women and children. Tragedies like this have occurred across Afghanistan, but in the case of Pushtun Zargun, a Western journalist was there to record it. This woman and her 2 sons were buried alive. When their bodies were finally dug out, they were found to be preserved like the corpses of Pompeii. Much of Afghanistan is now deserted. A quarter of the country's villages have been destroyed, and more than 5 million people have fled across the mountains to become refugees in Pakistan and Iran. Many had to travel for months by foot or on horseback, carrying their few possessions with them. On arrival in Pakistan and Iran, they are housed in huge refugee camps that stretch for miles through the heat and dust. Here the refugees live in conditions of deprivation and squalor. Farwar, a refugee nurse who has lived and worked in the camps, explains what life is like.
There are more than 350 camps in Pakistan. The population in these camps vary from 20,000 to 120,000. The camp itself is just very, very overpopulated, and the people just are squashed together. It's just tents and next to tents, and it's very dusty and dry in the camps. There are incredible shortages of food, malnutrition. Now, if you go to the camps, you will see an awful lot of malnutrition. Children cannot fight diseases because of that, and especially children and adults as well. During the winter, where I would say people mostly die of shortage of food, as well as shortage of not having blankets or home equipment or anything to cover themselves, and they die of pneumonia or respiratory infections. During the summer, I would say most children mainly die of malnutrition and diarrhea, because, I mean, really, they die because there is not enough food for them to fight the disease. Now for the people, the refugees, to go back home is going to be even tougher, because they have to start right from the scratch, building up a house or building a life for themselves again. And the facilities are not there. The villages are not there anymore. They have to build the villages. They have to work hard for it. Being a refugee is very, very hard. You not only lose your country, but you lose all your future, really. Whatever you planned in your life, you lose it. People, all they do all day is just they spend it in bereavement and under enormous stress, and that's the number of people they lost. And simply that they lost all their life. It's just a dark life living in the camp, really, because you've got no support, very little food to live, and very little space to move about. And it is very, very tragic to see people in the camp.
The international community and aid agencies have made some headway in the areas of health, education and employment. Western doctors and nurses have helped Afghan and Pakistani health workers organize a network of basic health units for the refugees. Medical staff are still stretched, but many Afghans now have access to elementary health care and to vaccination programs. Schools have been established in the camps, but because teachers, books and funds are scarce, many of the 2 million children of school age do not receive an education. Work schemes, designed to help refugees earn a modest living, have also been successfully developed. Work is important because it restores a sense of personal worth and provides an escape from the boredom and frustration of life in the camps. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan has raised hopes that there might now be a more lasting solution to the refugee problem. But this will not be achieved overnight. Jackie Ray, director of Afghan Aid, explains why.
Afghan Aid was started as a charity in 1983, specifically to try and get some sort of assistance inside Afghanistan, because it was discovered that although a certain amount of assistance was being given to all the refugees fleeing the country, those people who had remained inside and who were suffering from the effects of the war were receiving no assistance at all from outside. A third of the country's villages have been abandoned, a quarter of them have been destroyed, and agricultural production has dropped by over 50%. What we've developed now is what we call the Village Assistance Project. This is an attempt to help any aspect of rebuilding of a village. Now, this might be helping people directly with food, helping people to rebuild their houses, helping people to replace their lost sheep or oxen, helping them to buy a tractor or to clean their irrigation channels, or even to have seed and fertilizer to start their fields going again. What we do is we ask the people in the village, and it's usually a committee of village elders, what they feel their priorities are in order to get themselves back on their feet again. And they're the ones who choose, and we help them in whatever they need most. And we found that this has been very successful in giving them some control over their future. We don't want people to become dependent on aid, and the Afghans least of all, because they're people who stand on their own feet, and all they need is a little bit of assistance to get things back together again. The things they need most at the moment are seed, fertilizer, water, so they need their canals and irrigation channels cleaned. They need cement and wood beams for their houses. They need schools, desperately they need schools for their children. They need training for their teachers. They need clinics, hospitals, everything that a modern society asks for they need, but they will build it themselves if they just have a little assistance from outside. Because it's going to take them 8 to 10 years to get their country back into a livable condition again, it's very important that we don't forget them. While Afghanistan's in the news, everybody thinks about it, everybody's concerned to help. But this is a long problem. The Afghans are going to need some help from us for at least 10 years. It won't need a lot of money immediately. What it needs is a lot of money over a long period of time.
Peace and a lasting political settlement are necessary for the reconstruction of Afghanistan and for the repatriation of the 5 million refugees. But although peace is still some way off, the Afghans are confident that they will be able to rebuild their homeland. They are a proud and self-sufficient people, and they will want to do the work themselves. But after 10 years of war and with more than 1 million lives lost, labour and resources are in short supply. Reconstruction is a massive task that will take time, skill and huge amounts of money. The Afghans will have to summon all their reserves of ingenuity and resolve in the months and years to come.